Many students think that learning a language is limited to going to class, working your way through difficult texts, or having conversations with native speakers. These all contribute to your learning, but learning is not limited to things you can schedule in your calendar. If you think of it like that, you'll miss so many learning opportunities. Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about time and how we think about time when we learn languages. If you look at it the wrong way, Chinese is a subject to study or an activity to schedule, just like any other. But if you look at it the right way, learning Chinese seeps into all areas of life and isn't limited to hour-long blocks in your calendar. I'm not saying you have to learn Chinese full-time or in an immersion environment. I'm simply saying that the way you look at time and how you spend time when learning a language influences how much time you have available, and that also influences how much you learn. And this is true regardless if you're very ambitious and want to spend almost all your time learning Chinese, or if you're very busy with other things and only have a few hours a week. You still want to be efficient because you want as much gain as possible for every unit of time you invest. And of course, it's important to study the right thing at the right time, which is what we will talk about in this podcast episode. To analyze this problem and better understand how to think about time when learning languages, I will use a concept that I introduced back in 2011 called time quality. And this encourages you to think of time not as a fixed uniform resource, but rather as something that has different levels of quality. So we have high quality time and we have low quality time, and you can use these in different ways for learning Chinese. So high quality time is time where you can do anything you want. That is related to language learning, of course. You can think of time quality in relation to other things than language learning, but obviously we're talking about learning Chinese here, so that's what we will focus on. So high quality time is then when you can do anything you want. You have the time, energy, resources, and so on to engage in any learning activity you want. Of course, we are seldom completely unrestricted in this way, but let's imagine that you have 2 hours this afternoon where you have nothing else planned. You have access to a native speaker if you want to, you have access to the internet, study materials, anything you want. For many students, this is the only kind of time that counts. When you have an hour or two, you can sit down and do something, you can read your textbook, you can study grammar, learn pronunciation, talk with a native speaker, and so on. And it goes without saying that if you think like this and you also have a full-time job and you have a family and so on, you won't have that much time left for learning Chinese. But even if you don't have that many commitments and maybe study Chinese full-time, there's only a certain amount of this type of learning that you can cope with in a single day. So most people can't just schedule 8 hours of this type of studying in a day and then just go and do it. It simply doesn't work, and we will burn out pretty quickly if we do that. So low time quality then means that circumstances limit you in some way. So maybe you don't have enough time to sit down and do these things, or maybe you don't have access to someone to talk to if you want to practice pronunciation or speaking or something related to that, or you simply don't have access to the internet and the learning resources you're used to. It could also be other external factors, such as if you're on a bus or on a train, or maybe you're driving. There are certain things you can't do. So this time is not of the highest quality, but it still has some quality and can be used for certain things. So looked at the right way, this kind of time can still be used for learning Chinese, albeit not in the same way. The key insight here is that all activities where you engage with the language contribute to your learning, but that different activities require different time quality. And when thinking about this, the principle should be to always use time with as low quality as possible while still allowing you to engage in the activity. This might sound a little bit odd at first, but if you think of time as a resource, of course you want to use the lowest quality time first and save the high quality time for activities that really require it. Let's look at a very simple example just to show you what I mean. So let's say you have 2 hours a day to study Chinese, and 1 hour is at home just before going to bed, and the other hour is during a commute. Maybe you drive, maybe you go by train or bus. Let's also say that you've identified 2 activities that you want to focus on this week: pronunciation practice and listening practice. In this situation, I think most people would agree that it's a bit stupid to spend all your time at home practicing listening, because that is something you can easily do on your commute. It's easy to listen to podcasts or other recorded material on your commute, so you can do the listening there easily. But the same is not true for the reverse case. You cannot study pronunciation in a noisy train, and doing so while driving can be outright dangerous. In this case, the time during the commute is of lower quality than the time at home, and so the principle we just looked at tells us that when we schedule an activity, we should use the lowest time quality available that still allows us to do what it is we want to do. So if we look at listening, for example, we can get that done during the commute, and then we should, because that time is of lower quality than at home. Of course, we can also do the listening at home, but that would be wasting high quality time. And that would, of course, limit the activities we can engage in that require that high quality time, such as pronunciation. To rephrase this and put it very briefly, don't waste time you could do anything with on things that you could easily have done on the bus instead. With this in mind, there is a simple procedure for how to plan your activities. So first, you identify activities you should engage in to learn efficiently. And exactly what that means is beyond the scope of this article, but we did talk about a healthy, balanced diet for learning Mandarin in episode 42, so you can check that out if you want. Next, you should sort this list based on the time quality required, with the lowest quality first. So in our simplified example, listening requires time of lower quality than pronunciation practice, so it will come higher up on our list. Naturally, this is not a one-dimensional thing, so you can have several types of low-quality time, but that is a little bit overly complex and not really necessary. I'm mostly after getting at the things that you can do while doing other things, and the things that you really have to focus on completely, i.e. that require high-quality time. Next, you should try to go through and analyze your daily and weekly routines to identify what kind of time you have available and when. This is also a bigger topic that I cannot cover in this episode, but I did write an article about it called The Time Barrel: How to Find More Time to Study Chinese, and I put a link in the description. Finally, it's time to plan your activities, and then you should plan your low quality time first and save the high quality time for activities that truly require it. You can also approach the problem from the opposite direction while still relying on the same principle, and this might make more sense to some of you. And then the principle is simply to schedule the most demanding activities first. So if you have things that require really high quality time, make sure that those get done. Make sure that you use your high quality time for these things, and then figure out how you can use the lower quality time to get everything else done. These two approaches are of course opposite in a certain sense, but they lead to the same result. And personally, I prefer to look at each activity and see what kind of time slot I can use to complete that specific thing, rather than the other way around, but your mileage may vary and you might want to try both and see whichever works best for you. So let's look at some concrete examples of what this might look like. And these examples are not revolutionary. I'm not claiming to have come up with something new here. This is just a way of looking at time and making sure that you really do study the right thing at the right time. Example number 1 is to distribute your vocabulary learning across the day by carrying around vocabulary wherever you go. So this probably involves some kind of spaced repetition software, maybe Anki, maybe Skritter, maybe Pleco, maybe something else. But the point is that you review characters and words and so on, whatever you fancy, spread out over the whole day. You don't do it in the evening with high quality time, in front of your computer maybe, because that time you could have used for something else, so doing it there is kind of a waste of time quality. Instead, you find really low quality time, but not so low that you can't actually do anything with it. For example, if you're waiting for 5 minutes in a queue somewhere, or you're on the bus, or your friend is late for an appointment, or whatever it is. You can then chip away at your review queue, and if you do that consistently and you get into the habit of doing it when you have a few minutes to spare, you won't have to spend high quality time later. Example number 2, making sure that you always have something to listen to. And this is closely related to the example I brought up earlier, but listening is something which is mostly a matter of practice. The more you listen, the better. The more you focus on the content, the more you try to connect the spoken form to meaning and make sense of what's being said, the more you will learn. And of course, this requires focus, so maybe high quality time can be used, but you should also realize that low quality time can be used for listening as well. It's perfectly possible to listen while you cook, while you drive, while you exercise, and while you do lots of other things. Maybe you won't focus as much on the Chinese as you would if you only listened, but as long as you're focusing and trying to make sense of what's being said a bit, you are still learning a bit. And all this adds up over time, and there is no way that you can listen enough if you only think of this as hour-long chunks you schedule. I'm going to listen to Chinese from 2 p.m. to 4 p.m. on Thursday, and that's the only listening I'm going to do. That is indeed what most people actually do, but that's not what you should do. You should always have something to listen to. You should be able to turn it on for 5-10 minutes if you have time to spare, or if you're doing something where it would be nice to listen to something. And this will allow you to listen dozens of hours a week, and that's simply not possible if you're going to schedule all that listening. Example number 3 is to talk to yourself in Chinese. And this is something I've written an entire article about, and I'll put a link in the description. But even if it might sound cheap to talk to yourself, well, it is cheap in monetary terms, but it's actually a pretty good method for learning. And what's this got to do with time quality, you might wonder? Well, the point here is that when you practice speaking, and this is especially true if you're a beginner, you will spend almost all your time trying to find the right words, trying to remember the phrases you've learned, and so on. And this is something you actually don't have to have a partner to do. Obviously, it is much better if you have a conversation partner because then you have a real need to communicate, but simply trying to think about how to say something can make it quicker to retrieve these words when you actually need them in a similar situation. And then you can actually just talk to yourself. And obviously, this requires time of much lower quality than actual conversation practice because you can do it with yourself whenever you want, whereas with a conversation partner, well, to start with, you need another person. And most of us don't have native speakers following us around willing to talk to us whenever we want. Please note that I'm not saying that it's better to talk with yourself compared with talking to another person. I'm simply saying that when you don't have that option, when you have lower quality time available, you can still find learning activities that are meaningful and that are actually helpful, that are possible to perform with the time you have available. That way, you will also get more out of the actual conversations that you do have because you've already practiced retrieving the words and phrases that you need. The fourth and final example is preview and prepare before going to class. And this is something I've also written about, so I'll put a link in the description. So time quality here relates to resources, of course, because if you have a teacher, there are certain things that you can do that you can't do if you don't have a teacher. So that means that that time is of higher quality, and therefore you should only use it for things that really require high quality time. So one example of this would be to make sure that you know the basic definitions of words you know will come up during a class. If you don't do that, most of the class will actually be wasted telling you things that you could have equally well figured out yourself in advance. So here, the high quality time in class is used to do something that doesn't require high quality time. You could have done it on your own. If you learned the basic definitions in advance, you could have focused on other things such as conversation practice. You would be able to understand more of what your teacher says and more of the text you're reading, or if you're listening to something or whatever, but you would have gotten more out of the lesson if you had prepared properly. And while we're on the topic of teachers, I want to mention time quality from the teacher's perspective, because this of course applies when teaching or structuring courses as well, but it is a little bit trickier because as teachers we can't really decide what students do. We can assign homework, we can tell them to do things, but depending on the institution and the class and the students, we might not be able to actually count on them doing everything we tell them. This means that some things that in theory could equally well be done at home, such as, say, silent reading, that's not something you actually have to have a teacher to do because you're reading silently, that's what it means. But on the other hand, we know in practice that if we don't do it in class, the alternative might be that people don't do it at all, and then reading in class might make sense. If you're teaching highly motivated students who can count on doing things outside of class when you tell them, you should of course encourage them to do as many low-quality time tasks as possible outside class so that in class you can focus on the things that really matter. And this is of course not a novel idea. We have concepts like the flipped classroom that's been around for a long time now, which basically focuses on the same thing, making sure you prepare things you can do at home on your own, and then when you go to class you focus on the things that you really only can do in class or which are beneficial to do in class. So to wrap up this episode, time quality is just a tool you can use to look at the time you have available, the activities you want to engage in, and see how you can find the best combination of the two. Like I said earlier, this is for the lazy and the ambitious alike because efficiency, i.e. gain per unit time, is always desirable, and that is what time quality is about. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.